What happens when a man known for his towering ego suddenly finds himself outmaneuvered at his own gala? Atop a skyscraper in his own Hudson Yards development, Stephen M. Ross called Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani a fraud. Just 17 seconds later, Mamdani's legal team fired back with a $25 million lawsuit that is now shaking the city. The room wasn't packed with cameras, no press pool, no reporters scribbling notes in the corner. It was supposed to be a closed-door real estate industry gala in a ballroom overlooking the Hudson River. The city lights glittered like diamonds, the floors were polished marble, and the tables were lined with half-empty flutes of champagne and plates of miniature lobster rolls. For those who managed to get an invitation, it felt like another evening where Stephen Ross would take the stage and fire off familiar lines about deregulation to a crowd that already idolized him. But then something different happened. A cell phone caught it. Just a 19-second clip, grainy, shaky, the kind you'd scroll past on Twitter until the audio makes you stop. Ross, holding a microphone in one hand, gestured dismissively with the other. He leaned forward and said it, a sentence aimed squarely at Zohran Mamdani, delivered with a mix of arrogance and condescension he'd become known for. This Zohran Mamdani. He's not a public servant, he's a menace, Ross sneered. A total fraud, selling a fantasy to tenants while trying to bankrupt the people who build this city. He belongs on a picket line, not in Albany. The crowd of developers and investors laughed, some clapped, others stood to cheer. But the clip cut off there, leaving only the echo of Ross's words bouncing around the internet. By morning, the hashtag was everywhere. Millions of people had already watched it, dissected it, turned it into TikToks and sound bites. And then, 17 seconds later, Zohran Mamdani's team dropped a bomb. Not a tweet, not a press release demanding an apology, a legal filing, a $25 million defamation lawsuit against Stephen M. Ross, time-stamped and signed. It felt impossible. The clip hadn't even finished bouncing from phone to phone, and yet here was Mamdani's legal team, a small, barely known public interest firm, moving with the precision of a corporate powerhouse. The timing made people stop in their tracks. Commentators on NY1 couldn't believe it. Was it even real? How had they acted so quickly? On a local politics podcast, one host muttered on air, "This isn't a reaction. This is a trap. Mamdani's been waiting for this." Inside apartments across the 5 boroughs, the conversation shifted. People leaned over kitchen tables and asked their families, "Did you see this? Did you hear what Zohran just did?" Suddenly, the story wasn't about Ross's insult, it was about Mamdani's response. And here's where things got interesting. The footage spread further, but so did the sense that something larger was in play. It wasn't just one man taking offense at another. It was a question of power, money, and the cost of reckless words in public life. At a bodega in Queens, a man named Victor Morales put down his coffee and told a reporter, "Look, I don't agree with all of Mamdani's politics, but if a billionaire can just say anything about someone, call them a fraud with no proof, then what's left?" Words have to matter. His friend across the counter, shaking his head, replied, "Yeah, but Ross always says stuff like that." Why is this one different? And that was the spark. That was the moment people realized something wasn't business as usual. Because this wasn't a Twitter war. This wasn't two powerful men lobbing insults from a safe distance. This was legal paperwork, judges, real consequences. The more the story grew, the more people leaned in. Some were fascinated by Mamdani's speed, how ready his team seemed. Others speculated that maybe this was the plan all along. Let Ross talk until he crossed a line, and then hit back with a lawsuit that couldn't be brushed off. At Fordham University, a young law student named Elena Marquez was interviewed outside her campus. She smiled nervously and said, "It's kind of brilliant. They waited for the perfect moment. They knew he couldn't resist. And the second he said it, they had the documents ready. It's not about the money. It's about proving that lies have a price." For years, Mamdani's activism and Ross's empire had been locked in a strange orbit, two forces from different worlds whose names kept colliding in New York City politics. But this moment, this exchange felt different. It was sharp, immediate, and charged with the weight of something bigger than a feud. And as the clip kept circulating, as the lawsuit headlines rolled across every channel. The question wasn't just who would win in court. It was what this fight said about New York itself, about accountability, about the way powerful men use their words, and about whether truth still had any standing in the public square. But the real shock came next, when Mamdani's legal team revealed just how far ahead they had been planning this move. The lawsuit wasn't some vague threat tossed around on television. It was real, it was filed, and the timing was so exact that people didn't know whether to call it strategy or destiny. The Hudson Yards Gala clip had just begun its journey online when reporters in Manhattan received the official document. Zohran Mamdani, Stephen M. Ross, claim defamation damages, sought $25 million. The figure itself was enough to make jaws drop. It carried a message. This wasn't about irritation or pride. This was about impact. Ross had accused an elected official of being a fraud on video for political and financial gain, and Mamdani wasn't going to let it slide. On Crane's New York Business's morning show, the panel went quiet for several seconds after reading the first page live on air. Then one commentator, a former prosecutor, said bluntly, "This is surgical. They didn't scramble this together. They were waiting. This is Mamdani saying enough." Across the city, people were glued to their phones, social feeds lit up with the PDF of the complaint, screenshots of signatures, excerpts where Mamdani's lawyers laid out their argument with calm, pointed language. It wasn't angry, it wasn't petty, it was cold, precise, like a chess master moving a piece they'd been holding back for months. And then came the statement. Standing outside the New York County Supreme Courthouse, Mamdani's attorney, Priya Sharma, addressed a wall of microphones. She wore a simple dark suit, her tone clipped and clear as it echoed through every network carrying the feed live. Words have weight, but when a billionaire uses his platform to spread falsehoods about an elected official with intent to damage his reputation and mislead the public, that is not business. It is defamation. We have filed this lawsuit to hold Mr. Ross accountable for his repeated lies, and we will see this case through in court. Reporters shouted questions, but Sharma only gave one more line. This isn't about settling personal scores. This is about the truth. That sentence landed like a punch. In apartments, barbershops, and union halls, people repeated it. This is about the truth. For Mamdani's supporters, it was a rallying cry. For skeptics, it was at least a moment to pause. Meanwhile, Ross's gala clip was being rewatched in slow motion, dissected frame by frame. His words weren't vague, they were specific. A fraud. Legal experts on local news explained why that mattered. Those were direct accusations of deceitful conduct without evidence, said to a crowd in a public forum, exactly the kind of statement that could be considered defamatory. But there was something else, something that made the story even more electric. Reporters soon learned that the filing had been prepared days earlier. In fact, one journalist from the city claimed a contact in Mamdani's circle told them the documents were finalized more than 2 weeks before the Hudson Yards event, which meant Mamdani's team hadn't just reacted, they had anticipated. They knew Ross couldn't resist taking another shot, and they built their case in advance, waiting for the spark. At a coffee shop in Bushwick, 2 women argued over it while scrolling through their phones. "He walked right into it," said one, sipping her latte. "They baited him without even baiting him. Just waited." Her friend shook her head. "No, he baited himself. He always says stuff like that. They just finally called his bluff." And that was the conversation happening everywhere. Was this strategy or inevitability? Either way, it didn't matter. The lawsuit was filed, the statement was public, and the city was watching. In Manhattan, a local news crew captured footage of a group of NYU law students huddled in the campus library, reading the complaint aloud like a script. One of them, a first-year student named Jordan LeClaire, leaned back in his chair and said, "This is going to be in textbooks one day. Not about the money, not even about Ross. It's about whether words have limits when you're a billionaire." Meanwhile, Ross's allies tried to laugh it off. One surrogate on a business network said, "This is ridiculous. It's just another shakedown, another way for this socialist to stay in the headlines." But even as he spoke, the host interrupted. "But this is an actual lawsuit. This isn't politics. This is court." And that interruption, that tiny pause, shifted the energy. For the first time, it wasn't Stephen Ross setting the narrative achieves. It was Zohran Mamdani. And the contrast between the grainy video of Ross making jokes in a luxury ballroom and the sharp professional filing of Mamdani's legal team couldn't have been clearer. But if people thought the filing itself was shocking, they hadn't yet seen the depth of planning that went into it, or the way Mamdani's inner circle had been preparing for months behind closed doors. By the time the lawsuit made its way across every news ticker in the city, people started asking the same question. How could Mamdani's team have been so fast? You don't file a $25 million case in the time it takes to pour a cup of coffee. This had been in the works. Somewhere behind closed doors, lawyers and advisors had been building this moment for weeks, maybe months. In a cramped, bustling office overlooking a subway yard in Long Island City, the work had been taking shape long before Ross walked onto that Hudson Yards stage. The team wasn't a massive war room. It was a handful of public interest attorneys, legal researchers, and grassroots strategists sitting around mismatched tables, laptops glowing late into the night. The walls were covered in case law printouts, precedents, and highlighted quotes from Ross's past interviews. They weren't just gathering sound bites. They were building a map, connecting one reckless statement to the next until the picture was undeniable. Priya Sharma, the lead attorney, had a habit of pacing when she thought. Her heels clicked on the worn linoleum floor rhythmically while a junior associate, Carla Ramirez, scrolled through transcripts. One night in July, she stopped, pushed her glasses up her nose, and said, "Here, right here. He's said this before. Menace, dangerous, fraud, over and over again on business channels and in the Post. He's building his own track record." Priya leaned over her shoulder, reading the lines. Exactly. He's reckless with repetition, and one of these days, he'll hand us the perfect trigger. The room fell quiet. Everyone knew what she meant. They didn't have to provoke Stephen Ross. They just had to wait. The preparation wasn't just legal. Strategists close to Mamdani quietly gamed out the optics. They debated the risk of looking vindictive versus the reward of standing firm. Late in August, they rehearsed the timing. One staffer said, "If we file within minutes, it shows we were waiting. If we wait a day, it feels like a reaction. The sweet spot is right after. Close enough to sting, but fast enough to prove this isn't panic." Zohran Mamdani himself wasn't in those rooms every night, but he was briefed constantly. He was measured, deliberate. During a phone call with Priya, he said, "This can't be just about my name, Priya. This has to be bigger. If we're doing it, it's not to trade insults. It's for every tenant he's ever tried to silence. It's about the truth." Priya replied, "Then we need to be ready the moment he crosses the line." And ready they were. In September, just weeks before the Hudson Yards Gala, the team finalized the draft complaint. The documents were printed, reviewed, and locked in a fireproof cabinet in their small Queens office. All they needed was the moment. One fresh, undeniable instance of Ross accusing Mamdani of fraudulent conduct. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time. That night at Hudson Yards, when Ross gripped the microphone and delivered the line about Mamdani being a fraud who belonged on a picket line, the team's phones lit up on a secure signal chat. Within minutes, Priya was on a call with her colleagues. One attorney asked, "Is this the one?" Priya didn't hesitate. "Yes, file it." What most New Yorkers didn't see was the machinery clicking into place. Court clerks at the New York County Courthouse receiving the electronic submission. Assistants double-checking timestamps. By the time the clip had racked up 100,000 views online, the lawsuit was already public record. Inside the office, Carla whispered to a colleague, "People are going to think this was spontaneous." Her colleague smiled back. "Good, let them. It'll make it sting even more." And while all this was happening, Zohran was calm. He was at home in his Astoria apartment, reading over constituent casework, his phone buzzing with the updates. His wife glanced over at him and asked softly, "So it begins?" Zohran gave a small, almost tired smile. "No, it's been going on for years. Tonight just made it visible." Those words captured the mood. This wasn't a starting point. It was the unveiling of something that had been building quietly, steadily, behind the curtain. Reporters would later piece it together. How meticulous the preparation had been. how every step was mapped out in advance. Some criticized it as political theater. Others praised it as disciplined activism. But either way, it painted Mamdani not as reactive, but as a man playing a longer game, waiting for the right time to call a billionaire's bluff. But while Mamdani's team had the plan and the paperwork, it was the media storm that followed, which turned a legal case into a citywide obsession. By sunrise the next day, the lawsuit wasn't just a legal filing. It was the lead story on NY1, WNYC, and every local news broadcast. Cable networks like MSNBC rolled out dramatic graphics. The timing was irresistible. Newsrooms love symmetry, and this one had it. 17 seconds after Ross's insult, Mamdani's legal hammer dropped. It was the kind of headline producers dream about. On a local morning show, the host looked straight into the camera and said, "We've seen political rivalries before, but never a grassroots assemblyman and a real estate titan in a legal showdown like this. The speed, the preparation, the dollar figure, this is unlike anything we've witnessed in New York politics." Meanwhile, Bloomberg TV brought on a roundtable of analysts. One, a veteran litigator from a top Manhattan firm, leaned forward and told the panel, this wasn't spontaneous. This was tactical. They had the paperwork locked and loaded, and Ross, being Ross, walked straight into it. The clip of his words was replayed on TikTok, spliced with footage of Ross on stage, followed by the sound of a gavel slamming down. Millions watched. But the media frenzy isn't just what happens in front of cameras, it's the behind-the-scenes scramble, too. In the newsroom of the city, phones rang nonstop as reporters called contacts in Mamdani's circle, trying to confirm whether the lawsuit had really been prepared weeks in advance. One journalist, Nina Clark, recounted later, "I've never seen our editors so locked in. It felt like covering a war, not a lawsuit." Talk radio lit up with callers. One man from Brooklyn said, "Mamdani just played chess while Ross was playing checkers." Another from Staten Island shot back, "This is just a socialist shakedown. Nothing will come of it." The arguments weren't new, but the energy was. People weren't shrugging this off. It had their attention. On social media, the narrative split in two. Pro-Mamdani accounts, tenant unions, activist groups cheered the boldness, framing him as a fighter who had finally decided to stand up for the truth. Pro-Ross accounts, real estate blogs, business associations mocked the lawsuit, calling it desperate, a distraction from the city's real issues. Hashtags like #Mamdani strikes back and #NYSUME trended side by side. A local ABC affiliate sent a camera crew to a diner in Jackson Heights, Queens. The footage captured real voices. A waitress named Carol wiped down a counter while saying, "I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life. I've never seen something like this. It's not just talk, it's action." Mamdani's showing that you can't just say whatever you want without paying for it. At a corner booth, two men argued over breakfast. One wearing a Yankees cap said, "This is political theater. Mamdani doesn't need the money, it's just for headlines." The other leaned in, shaking his fork for emphasis. "It's not about money, it's about truth. My kids hear this stuff. If lies from powerful men go unchecked, they start to sound like facts." The camera lingered on the second man, his voice steady but tired, like someone who'd seen enough political games and wanted accountability. That clip made the evening news. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist. On his show, Stephen Colbert quipped, "Stephen Ross called Zohran Mamdani a fraud," and 17 seconds later, Mamdani said, "See you in court. I haven't seen a New York real estate deal close that fast in my life." The audience roared. But comedians aside, the lawsuit's seriousness kept dominating the cycle. By evening, Bloomberg was analyzing what a $25 million payout would mean for Ross's portfolio. Legal experts debated whether Mamdani could win such a massive claim. Some said yes, pointing to Ross's repeated pattern of inflammatory statements. Others said the bar for defamation is notoriously high, especially against a public figure. Still, the spectacle couldn't be denied. Mamdani wasn't chasing headlines, headlines were chasing him. A reporter stood outside the courthouse in Manhattan and delivered a live shot while holding the thick stack of papers filed earlier that day. She said, "It's rare to see a case move this quickly, but make no mistake, this document is real. This isn't posturing, it's litigation. And that word, litigation, cut through the noise. This wasn't a Twitter feud or a cable news brawl. This was about to become part of the judicial record of the state of New York. But outside of the media circus, what really mattered was how ordinary New Yorkers felt. The conversations at work, in kitchens, in classrooms, and how the public's mood began to shift. While anchors, analysts, and talk show hosts dissected every angle, the real pulse of the story wasn't in the studios. It was in the streets, living rooms, and workplaces across the 5 boroughs. At a hardware store on Grand Concourse in the Bronx, the television mounted near the register replayed the viral clip. A few customers lingered, leaning on carts as they watched. The cashier, a man in his late 40s named Victor, muttered under his breath, "Man, you can't just say stuff like that about people. Even if you don't like them, there's gotta be a line." A woman grabbing nails overheard him and responded, "Yeah, but it's politics. Lines don't exist anymore." Victor shrugged. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe this is what it takes. Someone saying, "Enough." Conversations like that played out everywhere. At a laundromat in Bushwick filled with the steady hum of dryers, 2 college students sat cross-legged on plastic chairs, scrolling through their phones. One looked up and said, "This feels different. He's not just clapping back on Twitter. He's dragging a billionaire into court. That's serious." Even among those who didn't like Mamdani's politics, there was a grudging respect for the move. A retired firefighter in Staten Island told a local reporter, "I don't agree with a lot of what that kid says, but he carries himself with conviction. And when you're accused of being a fraud without proof, you've got a right to defend yourself." Meanwhile, in barbershops and diners, people weren't just talking about lawsuits. They were talking about what it meant for the city. At a diner in Sunset Park, a waitress named Julia poured coffee for a table of construction workers debating the news. One driver said, "It's about time someone stood up to these guys. Ross has been acting like he owns the city for years." Another shook his head. "But suing him for $25 million, that's overkill." Julia, who'd been half listening, chimed in, "It's not about the money. It's about saying that truth matters. If the most powerful people can just lie with no consequences, what does that teach us?" The table went quiet. The workers sipped their coffee, and for a moment the noise of the diner seemed louder than their conversation. That pause, that moment when people had to think, was exactly the shift Mamdani's team was counting on. The reaction wasn't just about opinions, it was emotional. For many, the lawsuit carried a sense of relief, like someone had finally stood up to the chaos. For others, it sparked frustration, a belief that the fight between a socialist and a billionaire would overshadow the city's real issues. But either way, it had people talking, arguing, debating, reflecting. In the Bronx, a high school teacher named Angela Monroe asked her civics class to write down their thoughts on the case. One student wrote, "Powerful people should have consequences, like everyone else." Another scribbled, "This is just more fighting. We need unity." Angela collected the papers and thought about how a feud between an assemblyman and a developer had now become a lesson in her classroom about accountability and democracy. The reactions stretched far beyond political lines. In a quiet neighborhood in Queens, a retired school teacher named Evelyn shared her thoughts with a local NY1 crew. "When you've spent your whole life teaching kids not to lie, not to bully, and then you see the most powerful people do the opposite, it feels like everything's upside down. Mamdani filing this case, it tells kids that even billionaires can't get away with everything." Her words went viral after the clip aired. People online reposted it with the caption, "This Queen's grandma gets it." At the same time, Stephen Ross's supporters dug in. At a real estate industry luncheon just days later, a developer holding a glass of champagne shouted to a reporter, "Mamdani thinks he can silence us with lawyers? Well, good luck. We're not scared." A murmur of approval went through the room, but even there, the shadow of the lawsuit loomed. Reporters noticed the tone had shifted. For years, Ross's insults were seen as entertainment, blunt talk for his base of investors. Now, with a lawsuit attached, every word carried new weight. The supporters might still cheer, but the legal consequences were impossible to ignore. Citywide polls showed something unusual. A small but significant percentage of independent voters began leaning toward Mamdani's side, not because they suddenly became socialists, but because they valued the principle. A focus group in Manhattan revealed that many participants, while skeptical of both men, said things like, "At least Mamdani's standing up for the truth." The public reaction wasn't uniform, but it was loud, messy, and real. And in that noise, one thing became clear. Mamdani's gamble had already changed the conversation. But if the public's voice was beginning to sway, Ross's inner circle was already gearing up for a fight, scrambling to craft a defense and turn the tables back on their new rival. The mood inside Ross's Park Avenue office was anything but calm. The gala at Hudson Yards had ended like dozens before it. Cheers, photo ops, back-patting. But the following morning, everything felt different. Phones buzzed nonstop, advisors barked at one another, and aides scrambled to figure out just how Mamdani's legal team had pulled off such a swift strike. Inside a penthouse suite overlooking Central Park, Ross paced near the window while his closest advisors argued around a glass table littered with coffee cups. "25 million, one of them shouted, slamming a hand on the table. "That's not a lawsuit, that's a missile." Ross, red-faced and animated, jabbed his finger toward his lawyer, Eleanor Vance. "You tell them this is fake, total fake. No judge in New York is going to let this through. Mamdani's desperate. He knows his ideas are failing." Vance, a sharp-minded attorney with 2 decades of courtroom experience, tried to steady her voice. "Mr. Ross, it's not fake. It's filed. It's on the record. The claim is defamation, and it's serious. You accused an elected official of being a fraud in public." "That's..." Ross cut her off, his voice rising. "It's what I always do. People love it. It's free speech." Silence filled the room for a beat. One of his political advisors, Marcus Thorne, leaned back in his chair and sighed. "It's not free speech if it's provably false. That's the problem. They set a trap and you walked right into it." Ross's eyes narrowed. "No, he walked into mine. We'll turn this around." The challenge was immediate. Within hours, Ross's allies were dispatched to television studios. On Fox Business, one pundit declared, "This is political theater, plain and simple. Mamdani is using the courts to silence his critics and fundraise for his socialist agenda." But the argument didn't go unchallenged. On MSNBC, a host raised an eyebrow and said, "If it's political theater, it's the most prepared theater I've ever seen." Mamdani's team was ready with documents and legal arguments before Ross even left the stage. Behind the scenes, Ross's lawyers scrambled. They debated whether to argue that the lawsuit was frivolous or to lean hard on the First Amendment. Eleanor Vance pressed her case in the war room. "If we claim this is protected speech, we risk discovery. They'll dig into everything. Every past statement, every insult. Do you want that?" Ross waved her off. "We fight. That's all people want to see. Fight, fight, fight." Meanwhile, donors and investors grew anxious. A wealthy businessman who had been at the gala called Ross's aide directly. "Look, I'll keep supporting the PAC, but if this drags through the courts, where's my money going? Legal fees or new projects?" That pressure mounted. Ross couldn't afford to look weak, but he also couldn't afford to bleed resources. A few days later, he decided to face the storm head-on during a scheduled interview on a conservative business network. He looked directly into the camera, the picture of defiance. "This Zohran Mamdani, he thinks he can scare me with a lawsuit? $25 million? It's ridiculous. I've been saying the truth about his dangerous ideas my whole life, and now he wants to shut me up. But we're not going to be silenced, are we?" He tried to frame it as a battle for the soul of the city. They call it defamation. I call it patriotism. They want to control what you say, what you think. We're not going to let them. But political strategists watching weren't impressed. On CNN, Van Jones remarked, "He's trying to frame it as freedom of speech, but the law doesn't work that way. You can't accuse someone of being a fraud without evidence. That's not opinion. That's a statement of fact, and it's false." Inside Mamdani's camp, the reaction was measured. Priya Sharma, his lead attorney, told her team in Queens, "Let him yell. Every word makes our case stronger. The more he insists, the easier it is to prove reckless disregard for the truth." The contrast couldn't have been sharper. One man shouting from a television studio, the other quietly building a legal wall around his reputation. But just as Ross's team tried to regain control, Zohran Mamdani himself finally broke his silence. For days, he had let his legal team carry the weight. Reporters clamored for a quote as he attended assembly sessions in Albany, but he stayed quiet, offering only polite nods. The silence itself became news. "Why hasn't Mamdani spoken?" one anchor on NY1 asked. "Is he letting the courts do the talking?" That question was answered on a Thursday evening at a CUNY auditorium in Manhattan, where Mamdani had been scheduled months before to headline a panel on civic engagement. The room was packed with students, professors, and activists, but also with cameras and journalists itching for more than a talk about local government. When Mamdani stepped to the podium, the room stood, applauding for nearly a full minute. He waited, nodding in thanks before leaning toward the microphone. "I came here tonight to talk about community organizing," he began with a half smile. "But I know most of you aren't here for just that." Laughter rippled through the crowd, breaking the tension. He paused, letting it fade. His tone shifted, steady and serious. "In this city, we argue. We disagree. That's part of democracy. But disagreement is different from dishonesty. Disagreement is different from defamation." The room grew still. When someone stands on a stage and calls me a fraud without evidence, what they're really saying is that facts don't matter anymore. That truth is optional. And if we let that stand, if we shrug and say, "That's just politics," then we're teaching our kids that lies are leadership. And I can't accept that. The crowd broke into applause. He lifted a stack of notes, then set them aside. "I've spent my life telling young people that your words matter, that they can build bridges or burn them. And I'll be honest with you, this lawsuit isn't about a number on a page. It's not about money. It's about whether we still believe words have weight." The room erupted again, but Mamdani held up his hand, gently quieting them. "Now, I know some people will say this is personal, that it's Zohran versus Stephen, that it's just another feud in a city already tired of feuds. But I want you to hear me clearly. This isn't about personalities. It's about principle. If a lie is told loud enough, long enough, and often enough, people start to mistake it for the truth. And when your bank account is big enough, your voice is very, very loud." Outside the auditorium, a small group of pro-business protesters had gathered, their chants of "Stop the Shakedown" clashing with cheers of support from inside. Mamdani continued, "I don't expect everyone to agree with me. That's the point of democracy. But I do expect that we can tell the difference between a disagreement and a lie. And if it takes going to court to remind folks of that difference, then so be it." The applause this time shook the auditorium. After the event, microphones crowded him as he walked to his car. One reporter called out, "Assemblyman, do you think you'll win?" Mamdani stopped, looked directly into the camera, and said, "I think the truth will win." Then he ducked into the vehicle, leaving those 5 words to echo across every network. That single phrase became the headline. "The truth will win." Cable banners ran it in bold letters, and newspaper websites splashed it across front pages, and within hours it was trending citywide. In Brooklyn, a father showed his 10-year-old daughter the clip and said, "That's how you fight back, without yelling, without insults, just with conviction." On the other side, Ross's defenders scoffed. A host on a local conservative talk radio station said, "The truth will win sounds nice, but it's naive. Courtrooms aren't about truth, they're about lawyers." Still, even among skeptics, Mamdani's calm delivery stood out. He hadn't insulted Ross, he hadn't raised his voice. He framed the battle as something larger than himself, something every New Yorker had a stake in. But even as Mamdani spoke with poise and principle, the gears of the legal system were beginning to turn, pulling both men toward a courtroom showdown unlike any the city had ever seen. The lawsuit had been filed, the public statements made. But now the fight shifted into a slower, heavier rhythm, the rhythm of the courts. For all the shouting on business networks and polished sound bites, the real battlefield became stacks of paper, motions, deadlines, and hearings at the New York County Supreme Courthouse. Clerks wheeled in carts filled with documents, Bearing both men's names, the seal of the court stamped on each page a quiet reminder that this wasn't just politics anymore. It was history being written in legal ink. Judges and clerks whispered about the surreal nature of the case. A Queen's assemblyman versus a real estate titan. One bailiff muttered, shaking his head, "Never thought I'd see this in my lifetime." Ross's attorneys moved first, filing a motion to dismiss. His lawyer, Eleanor Vance, argued in her brief that the comments Ross made at Hudson Yards were political opinion and rhetorical hyperbole, not factual assertions, and therefore protected under the First Amendment. But Mamdani's team was ready. Priya Sharma, calm and methodical, filed a response so thorough that legal analysts later called it a blueprint for high-profile defamation claims. Her argument was simple. When a billionaire accuses an elected official of being a fraud in front of an audience without evidence, that is not opinion. It is a false statement of fact, and no one, not even a billionaire, is above accountability for lies. Legal talk shows broke down the filings like sports analysts reviewing a playoff game. Meanwhile, law schools across the city turned the case into a live classroom. At Columbia Law School, a professor projected the complaint on a screen, telling his students, "This is what constitutional law looks like in practice. Watch how both sides frame the same sentence completely differently." Behind the scenes, both camps worked late nights. In Ross's Park Avenue office, advisors worried not just about the legal fight, but the financial exposure. Donors began quietly asking whether their contributions would be funneled into legal costs. "We need reassurance," one text from a wealthy developer read. "No one wants to bankroll a losing battle." In contrast, Mamdani's circle in Queens treated the buildup with discipline. Carla Ramirez, the young associate, spent hours cross-referencing transcripts, highlighting Ross's repeated use of words like fraud and menace. Every instance strengthened their claim. The media camped outside the courthouse. Pundits debated whether the case would even reach trial. On a late-night news panel, a former judge named Sylvia Kent summed it up. "The public sees this as two titans clashing. In reality, this will come down to painstaking details. Dates, words, context. The courtroom doesn't care about applause lines. It cares about proof." And yet, proof was exactly what Mamdani's team had been gathering. In October, they subpoenaed records of Ross's past statements, piecing together a history of reckless language. The move rattled Ross's allies, who worried about discovery, exposing years of unfiltered rhetoric. Just when people thought the case might drag into endless motions, a sudden turn shifted the momentum. It started with a leak. A sealed document somehow found its way into the hands of a reporter at the New York Times. The file contained internal memos from Ross's legal team, outlining fears about discovery. In blunt language, one lawyer warned, "If this case proceeds, Mr. Ross's history of repeated false statements will become admissible evidence, creating exposure far beyond the Hudson Yards remarks." The memo was devastating. Within hours, it was published online and dissected by cable hosts. The impact was immediate. Several high-dollar donors quietly pulled their support. One real estate developer canceled a fundraiser, telling associates, "I'm not writing checks for a legal nightmare." For the first time, Ross's circle looked rattled. Meanwhile, Mamdani's team capitalized on the momentum. Priya Sharma scheduled a press conference on the courthouse steps. She didn't gloat. Instead, she held up a printout of the Times article and said calmly, "This speaks for itself. Our position has always been that reckless lies have consequences. The defense's own words confirm it." The clip of Sharma holding that paper became iconic. The memo wasn't the only blow. Weeks later, a state Supreme Court judge denied Ross's motion to dismiss. The ruling was clear. The case would proceed. The judge wrote, "Accusing a public figure of fraudulent conduct without factual basis is not protected speech. The plaintiff has sufficiently pled a claim for defamation." Courtroom observers gasped. Ross's attorneys shuffled papers nervously. Mamdani's team exchanged quiet nods. Headlines blared, "Case moves forward." Then came the financial shockwave. Reports surfaced that one of Ross's holding companies had taken out a massive loan to cover mounting legal fees. Bloomberg broke the story, and the headline read, "Ross's legal troubles deepen with 25 analysts Mamdani suit." That financial pressure changed the narrative. No longer was the lawsuit just about words, it was about survival. The combination of the leaked memo, donor retreat, and judicial ruling painted a grim picture for Ross. Public opinion polls shifted further. In a garage in the Bronx, a mechanic named Jorge Ramirez summed it up to a local station. Ross has always acted like nothing could touch him, but this is touching him. This is real. The turning point wasn't a fiery speech or a dramatic outburst. It was paper, money, and cold legal reality. Slow, grinding forces that even Stephen Ross couldn't spin away. And as the weight bore down on him, Mamdani's side began shaping the bigger narrative, what the case meant for the city's understanding of truth and accountability. By the time winter crept in, the lawsuit had stopped being just another headline. It had become part of the city's conversation. Everyone seemed to understand that this fight was about more than Zohran Mamdani or Stephen Ross. It was about whether truth could still matter in a world drowning in noise. In December, another hearing packed the courthouse in Manhattan. Reporters jostled for position, while everyday citizens lined up in the cold just to say they'd witnessed it. Inside, Zohran Mamdani sat quietly beside his attorneys, his face calm, listening as the judge outlined the timeline of the case. Stephen Ross was absent, but his lawyers filled the benches, passing notes frantically, their whispers carrying through the courtroom. At one point, Priya Sharma rose and addressed the court. "This case is not about political rivalry," she said. "It is about words that accuse an elected official of being a fraud. Words spoken without evidence, repeated for profit and applause. We ask this court to affirm that in this city, the truth is not negotiable." Her tone wasn't theatrical. It was measured, deliberate. That restraint made it powerful. People in the gallery leaned forward, hanging on her words. Afterward, outside the courthouse, microphones clustered around Zohran Mamdani. For the first time since the filing, he spoke not in speeches or interviews, but in a candid moment that felt personal. "I didn't want this lawsuit," he admitted, hands tucked into his coat pockets against the winter chill. "But I felt I had no choice. If lies from the powerful become normal, if we shrug them off, then we lower the bar for everyone. I represent a district full of families, of kids. I want them to grow up in a city where facts still mean something. That's why we're here." It wasn't a soundbite, it was a lesson delivered without polish, and that, perhaps, was why it resonated. In communities across the boroughs, people repeated his words. A teacher in the Bronx shared the clip with her students, asking them to write essays on why truth matters. A community leader in a Brooklyn church quoted Mamdani's line in a meeting, weaving it into a message about honesty in everyday life. Even skeptics, people who disagreed with his politics, admitted the sincerity struck a chord. Meanwhile, Ross's side grew more combative. In op-eds, they framed the lawsuit as an attack on free enterprise, a plot to silence him. Yet each outburst only fed into Mamdani's argument that reckless words have consequences. Each time Ross repeated the accusations, pundits shook their heads and said, "He's digging himself deeper." By January, polls showed something rare. A majority of New Yorkers, including independents, sided with Mamdani on the principle of the case. They hadn't suddenly embraced his politics, but they saw in his fight a principle they wanted to protect. One pollster explained, "It's not about left or right, it's about accountability." The case had not yet gone to trial, but the cultural verdict was already forming. Mamdani had managed to shift the narrative from a personal insult to a civic principle. The $25 million figure still loomed large, but most people understood the money was symbolic. What mattered was the message. Truth has value, and lies carry a cost. Back in Queens, as he left a private meeting with his legal team, Mamdani stopped to greet a small group of supporters waiting outside in the cold. One woman, a tenant organizer wrapped in a heavy scarf, shook his hand and said, "Thank you for reminding us our words still matter." Zohran smiled and replied, "They always have. We just forget sometimes." That exchange was small, quiet, almost invisible compared to the roar of cable debates, but it carried the weight of everything the lawsuit represented. In the end, the story wasn't about two men trading blows. It was about what their clash revealed. that even in an age of division, people still hunger for honesty, for integrity, for leaders who treat words not as weapons, but as promises. And that is the bigger lesson. In politics, in business, in life, words shape reality. They can tear down or build up, deceive or guide. When spoken carelessly, they leave scars. When spoken truthfully, they lay foundations. So whether you're a billionaire developer or just someone talking at the dinner table, remember this: your words carry weight. They matter more than you think. And if you've followed this story and believe that truth still deserves a place in our conversations, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because we'll keep telling stories that remind us, through conflict and through struggle, that accountability and honesty still matter. The truth will win,